August 1945, a quiet morning inside a guarded compound in the Pacific. The air was warm and still. Beyond the wire fencing, palm trees swayed gently under a pale sky. Inside the compound, rows of simple wooden barracks stood in silence, their walls weathered by months of tropical heat and rain. A small group of Japanese women stood near the central yard. Some wore faded civilian dresses. Others still wore the remnants of wartime uniforms. Nurses, clerks, and civilian workers who had been caught in the sweeping tide of the Pacific War. They watched as an American guard approached a wooden table near the barracks entrance. In his hands was a bundle of folded papers. Newspapers. He placed them quietly on the table before stepping back. For a moment, no one moved. For years, information had been tightly controlled inside wartime Japan. Newspapers carried only approved messages. Radio broadcasts repeated the same confident promises of victory. Now, in an enemy prison camp, uncensored pages lay open before them. And within those pages was a version of the war many of them had never seen before. But to understand why such a small moment carried such weight, it is necessary to step back to the beginning of the Pacific War. The story of Japanese civilian prisoners in American custody cannot be separated from the vast and violent struggle that unfolded across the Pacific during the early 1940s. On December 7, 1941, the war between Japan and the United States began with the sudden attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. In the months that followed, the Imperial Japanese military launched a sweeping campaign across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Their forces rapidly seized territory that stretched thousands of miles, from Hong Kong and the Philippines to Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. These early victories reshaped the lives of millions. Cities changed hands. Governments collapsed. Military garrisons surrendered. Civilian populations found themselves trapped between advancing armies and shifting front lines. Among those caught in this vast upheaval were Japanese civilians living outside the home islands. Throughout the early 20th century, Japanese migration had spread across parts of the Pacific. Merchants, laborers, teachers, and nurses had settled in colonial territories and trading ports. Some worked in fishing communities, others in hospitals or businesses connected to the expanding Japanese empire. When Allied forces began pushing back against Japan's expansion, many of these civilians suddenly found themselves in dangerous territory. The turning point began in 1942. After the early shock of Pearl Harbor and the fall of several Pacific strongholds, American military planners began organizing a long campaign to reclaim occupied territory. Battles such as Midway in June 1942 halted Japanese naval expansion and shifted the balance of the war. From that point forward, the United States and its allies slowly began advancing westward across the Pacific. This strategy became known as island hopping. Instead of attacking every Japanese-held position, Allied forces targeted key islands with airfields and supply routes. By capturing strategic points, they could isolate Japanese garrisons and weaken the empire's defensive network. Each new landing brought American troops into contact not only with Japanese soldiers, but also with civilian populations that had been living under wartime control. Some of these civilians were local island residents. Others were Japanese settlers who had arrived before or during the war. When American forces captured islands such as Guam, Saipan, and later Okinawa, they encountered communities where military personnel and civilians lived side by side. Among them were women serving in a wide variety of roles. Some worked as nurses or medical assistants in military hospitals. Others had been employed in clerical positions, communications offices, or supply depots. Many were simply family members of soldiers or administrators stationed on the islands. For American troops advancing through these territories, the presence of civilians created complex decisions. International law offered guidelines for how prisoners of war should be treated. The Geneva Convention of 1929, which governed the treatment of captured soldiers, emphasized humane conditions, medical care, and protection from violence. However, civilians captured in combat zones were often classified differently. Some were held as civilian internees, while others, especially those closely connected to the military, were temporarily placed in guarded compounds until their status could be determined. American commanders had to manage these populations carefully. Temporary camps were established in newly captured areas to house prisoners until the situation stabilized. These camps varied widely depending on location and available resources. Some are built near airfields or supply bases. Others were set up in former Japanese facilities that had been abandoned during the fighting. Inside the compounds, daily life followed strict routines. Prisoners were registered, given basic living quarters, and assigned schedules for meals and sanitation. Guards monitored movement within the camps, but many facilities allowed limited daily activity inside the fenced areas. For many prisoners, the experience was filled with uncertainty. Communication with the outside world was limited. Rumors about the war spread quickly through the barracks. People tried to piece together information from scraps of conversation, overheard announcements, or fragments of reports brought in by guards. But one factor shaped the prisoners' understanding of the war more than anything else: information. Most Japanese civilians and military personnel had spent years living under a system where the government carefully controlled what news reached the public. Wartime newspapers emphasized victories and heroism. Reports of defeats were rare or heavily framed to preserve morale. For those now sitting behind barbed wire in an Allied camp, the war they had known through official reports was about to collide with a very different version of reality. And that contrast would become even clearer once they began encountering the Allied world beyond the fence. To understand why the sight of a simple newspaper could cause hesitation among prisoners, it is important to understand how information had been managed inside Japan during the war years. By the late 1930s, Japan had already spent nearly a decade engaged in large-scale conflict. The Second Sino-Japanese War, which began in 1937, placed enormous demands on the country's government, military, and population. Maintaining public support for the war effort became a central concern for political and military leaders. Information was treated as a strategic resource. Japanese newspapers, radio broadcasts, and magazines operated under strict oversight from the state. Government ministries and military authorities monitored what could be printed or broadcast, ensuring that news reports aligned with official goals. Stories emphasized sacrifice, national unity, and loyalty to the emperor. Editors were expected to cooperate with government directives. Negative reports that might weaken morale were often reduced or removed entirely. Military setbacks were rarely described in detail. Instead, reports focused on heroic resistance or strategic withdrawals, framing events in ways that preserve confidence in Japan's eventual victory. For many civilians, the information environment became increasingly narrow as the war continued. Radio stations repeated government announcements. Newspapers carried similar headlines across the country. War correspondents embedded with military units wrote stories that highlighted bravery and determination, but rarely discussed the broader strategic picture. The system was not unique to Japan. Nearly every nation involved in the Second World War used propaganda and censorship in some form. Governments feared that uncontrolled information could damage morale or reveal sensitive military details. But in Japan, the wartime information structure was particularly strict. Loyalty to the emperor and nation was deeply embedded in education and public life. Questioning official reports was uncommon, and alternative sources of information were limited. Foreign news agencies had little access to the country after the war expanded across the Pacific. As a result, many Japanese civilians had only a partial understanding of how the war was unfolding beyond their immediate surroundings. During the early years of the conflict, official reports often emphasized success. Victories across Southeast Asia and the Pacific were widely publicized. The capture of territories, such as Singapore in 1942, was presented as proof of Japan's strength and strategic brilliance. But the tide of war had begun to change. After the Battle of Midway, Japanese naval losses limited the empire's ability to expand further across the Pacific. Over the next several years, American industry and military production began to reshape the strategic balance. Shipyards on the American West Coast launched new aircraft carriers and destroyers at remarkable speed. Aircraft factories produced thousands of planes. Training programs expanded to prepare pilots, sailors, and soldiers for an increasingly global war. These developments gradually translated into new Allied offensives. Island by island, American forces advanced closer to the Japanese defensive perimeter. Battles such as Guadalcanal, Troa, Saipan, and Leyte Gulf marked important stages in the campaign. Yet information about these battles often reached Japanese civilians in carefully managed form. Official reports highlighted bravery and sacrifice, but rarely described the full scale of losses. Even when defeats could not be entirely hidden, they were framed within narratives of endurance and continued resistance. For those living within Japanese territory, it was difficult to see the larger pattern of the war. For those outside Japan, especially civilians caught in territories that later fell to Allied forces, the information gap became even more complicated. When Japanese settlers, nurses, and workers were captured during American offensives, they entered an environment where information was not controlled in the same way. American newspapers reported both victories and setbacks. Military updates circulated widely among soldiers and civilians. While censorship still existed in the United States during wartime, the press operated with a different structure and tradition than the tightly supervised Japanese system. This difference created a striking contrast inside prison camps. When newspapers arrived in these compounds, sometimes weeks or months after publication, they carried stories from a world that many prisoners had never encountered. Reports discussed battles across multiple continents. Maps illustrated the shifting front lines. Headlines described political decisions, diplomatic negotiations, and economic mobilization. For prisoners who had spent years hearing only one version of the war, these pages presented a far broader view of events. And as the conflict moved toward its final stages in 1944 and 1945, the information contained in those newspapers would become increasingly difficult to reconcile with the expectations many prisoners had once held. Because inside those pages was a story that suggested the war was moving toward a very different ending. By the later years of the Pacific War, American-controlled compounds across newly captured islands held a mixture of prisoners whose lives had been pulled into the conflict in very different ways. Some were military personnel captured during battles. Others were civilians who had been living in territories that shifted from Japanese to Allied control as the front lines moved westward. Among these detainees were Japanese women. Their presence inside the camps reflected the complicated reality of wartime societies. The war in the Pacific was not fought only by soldiers on distant beaches. Entire communities had been drawn into the machinery of empire. Teachers, clerks, nurses, shopkeepers, and families who followed military administrators to remote islands across the Pacific. When Allied forces arrived, these civilians were often gathered and placed under guard until authorities could determine their status. For the women inside these compounds, daily life was shaped by uncertainty. Some had worked in hospitals or administrative offices connected to the Japanese military. Others had arrived on the islands years earlier as settlers or family members of officials. In many cases, they had lived through months of isolation as American forces advanced across the region. Capture brought relief from the immediate dangers of battle, but it also raised difficult questions about what would come next. The camps themselves were usually simple and temporary. Barbed wire fencing marked the perimeter. Guard towers overlooked the compounds. Inside, rows of wooden barracks provided basic shelter from the heat and rain common across the tropical Pacific. Conditions varied depending on the location and the stage of the war, but most facilities operated according to structured daily routines. Morning roll calls counted the prisoners. Food was distributed at scheduled times. Water was rationed carefully, especially on islands where supplies were limited. Prisoners were often assigned small tasks within the camp. cleaning common areas, maintaining barracks, or assisting with basic organization. Despite the restrictions, many American units responsible for the camps attempted to maintain order and stability. Medical personnel inspected prisoners for illness or injury. Supplies such as clothing or blankets were distributed when available. In some locations, prisoners were permitted to move within certain sections of the compound during daylight hours. Yet the emotional environment remained tense. The Pacific War had been marked by brutal fighting and deep mutual suspicion between opposing forces. Stories of harsh treatment circulated widely on both sides. Many prisoners entered the camps expecting severe punishment or harsh confinement. Instead, the routines they encountered were often shaped more by regulation than revenge. American soldiers assigned to guard duty were usually young men who had spent months fighting across distant islands. For many of them, supervising civilian detainees, especially women, was a new and unfamiliar responsibility. Military discipline emphasized restraint. Camp guards were expected to enforce rules and maintain security, but they were also instructed to avoid unnecessary confrontation. The presence of civilians meant that conditions had to be managed carefully to prevent panic or disorder inside the compounds. These daily interactions created moments of quiet cultural encounter. Prisoners observed their guards closely. The soldiers' behavior, language, and routines offered glimpses into a foreign society that many detainees had previously known only through wartime propaganda. For some prisoners, the differences were subtle but striking. American soldiers joked openly with one another. They spoke casually in front of prisoners rather than maintaining rigid formality. In some camps, female American personnel, nurses, or administrative staff occasionally appeared within the compounds, performing inspections or delivering supplies. For Japanese women raised in a society with strict wartime discipline, these scenes could feel unfamiliar. Yet the most powerful contrasts did not always appear in direct interactions between guards and prisoners. Instead, they emerged through the everyday objects that moved between the two worlds. Crates of supplies arrived from American bases. Medical kits carried labels printed in English. Soldiers sometimes left behind magazines or newspapers after finishing them. At first, these items seemed insignificant, but gradually, prisoners began to realize that the materials entering the camp carried something far more revealing than food or clothing. They carried information. Within the pages of those newspapers were stories about battles across the Pacific. Reports described military operations, political decisions, and the shifting fortunes of nations locked in a global war. For many prisoners, these printed pages would become the first clear window into how the war was unfolding beyond the boundaries of the camp. And the more they read, the more they began to understand that the world outside the barbed wire might be changing in ways they had never imagined. Inside the camp compounds scattered across the Pacific, information moved slowly. Most prisoners had no direct contact with the outside world. Letters were rare, and communication with family members in Japan was usually impossible during the war years. News about the conflict arrived in fragments. Rumors whispered between barracks, occasional announcements from camp officials, or overheard conversations among guards. But newspapers changed that. For American soldiers stationed on remote islands, newspapers were a routine part of military life. Copies of publications such as Stars and Stripes, the U.S. military newspaper, circulated widely among troops. Civilian papers from the United States sometimes arrived weeks after publication, carried across the Pacific by transport ships and aircraft. Once soldiers finished reading them, these papers often remained in common areas or supply offices. In some camps, guards allowed prisoners to read discarded copies after they had been inspected. The decision was usually practical rather than symbolic. Newspapers helped pass the time, and the articles rarely contained information that could threaten security inside a prisoner compound. Yet the impact of these pages could be profound. For many Japanese prisoners, the structure of Allied newspapers looked unfamiliar from the start. Headlines appeared in bold type across the front page. Photographs showed battlefields, political leaders, and scenes from cities far beyond the Pacific Islands. Maps illustrated the shifting lines of the war. Articles described events in Europe, North Africa, and Asia, revealing that the conflict stretched far beyond the battles most prisoners had heard about through wartime broadcasts. For readers accustomed to tightly controlled information, the tone of these reports could feel surprising. American newspapers did not present the war as a continuous series of victories. Instead, they discussed both successes and setbacks. Articles described logistical challenges, political debates, and the human cost of the fighting. Even this difference in style could feel significant. It suggested a world where the news did not follow a single official narrative. But the deeper shock came from the details contained within the reports themselves. Battle after battle appeared in the articles, names that many prisoners had never encountered before. Reports described the intense fighting on islands such as Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Other articles discussed naval clashes like the Battle of Leyte Gulf, one of the largest sea battles in history. Each report carried statistics, maps, and analysis explaining how the battles had unfolded. Gradually, a broader pattern became visible. The articles showed Allied forces moving steadily across the Pacific, capturing islands that once formed part of Japan's defensive perimeter. Airfields built on those islands allowed American bombers to fly deeper toward the Japanese home islands. For prisoners who had grown up hearing reports of steady imperial expansion, these maps told a very different story. The empire that once stretched across the Pacific appeared to be shrinking. The psychological impact of this realization varied from person to person. Some prisoners read quietly, studying the articles with careful attention. Others discussed the news with friends or relatives inside the barracks, comparing the reports with the fragments of information they had heard earlier in the war. At times, disbelief remained strong. Years of wartime messaging had shaped expectations about Japan's strength and determination. It was difficult for some readers to accept that the empire's position had weakened so dramatically. Yet the newspapers continued to arrive. New issues carried updated reports about bombing raids over Japanese cities. Articles described the growing pressure placed on Japan's industrial centers and transportation networks. Photographs showed American ships, aircraft, and soldiers moving across newly captured territory. Even without commentary from the guards, the message inside these pages became increasingly clear. The war was approaching a decisive stage. Within the camps, the act of reading gradually turned into a moment of quiet reflection. Groups of prisoners gathered around tables or benches to examine the latest issue. Some traced the movement of front lines across printed maps. Others focused on the dates attached to each article, trying to understand how quickly events were unfolding. In those quiet moments, information did something that years of propaganda had often prevented. It allowed individuals to see the war not as isolated battles or heroic stories, but as a vast and changing system of events unfolding across the world. And eventually, the news carried by those newspapers would reach a point where the reality of the war could no longer be interpreted in different ways. Because in the summer of 1945, the headlines themselves would begin to describe the final turning point of the conflict. By the summer of 1945, the war in the Pacific had entered its final and most intense phase. For months, Allied forces had been advancing steadily toward Japan's home islands. Major battles across the Western Pacific had pushed American naval and air power within striking distance of the Japanese mainland. Airfields captured on islands such as Saipan and Tinian now allowed long-range bombers to fly directly toward Japanese cities. Inside the prisoner compounds scattered across the region, the newspapers arriving in supply shipments began carrying headlines that reflected this accelerating pace of events. The reports described the brutal fighting on Okinawa, which began in April 1945 and lasted nearly 3 months. It was one of the largest amphibious assaults of the Pacific War. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers from both sides fought across the island's ridges, villages, and coastal plains. For American commanders, Okinawa was more than another island battle. It was considered a possible preview of what an invasion of Japan itself might look like. The cost of the battle was staggering. Tens of thousands of soldiers were killed or wounded, and large sections of the island were devastated by artillery and aerial bombardment. For prisoners reading the reports weeks later, the descriptions revealed just how destructive the final phase of the war had become. But even as the battle for Okinawa continued, other developments were already changing the strategic picture. Newspaper articles increasingly discussed the relentless bombing campaign against Japanese cities. Beginning in late 1944, American B-29 Superfortress bombers had begun flying long-distance missions from bases in the Mariana Islands. These aircraft carried enormous bomb loads and were capable of reaching major industrial centers across Japan. By March 1945, large-scale firebombing raids had devastated sections of Tokyo and other cities. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed in a single night as incendiary bombs ignited fires across densely built urban areas. Photographs printed in American newspapers showed massive formations of bombers flying above cloud layers, their wings stretching across the sky in long, organized lines. Accompanying articles described the scale of the operations and the strategic reasoning behind them. For prisoners inside the camps, these images were often difficult to interpret. Many had never seen modern strategic bombing described in such detail. The idea that entire cities could be targeted from the air was unsettling, particularly for those who still had family members living in Japan. Yet the most dramatic headlines of all appeared in early August 1945. One morning, a new issue of the newspaper arrived with a front page that looked different from the ones before it. The headline described a weapon that few people anywhere in the world had fully understood before that moment. On August 6, 1945, an American B-29 bomber dropped an atomic bomb over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The article explained that the weapon released an explosive force far greater than conventional bombs. Reports described widespread destruction across the city and the immediate collapse of much of its infrastructure. 3 days later, another article followed. On August 9, 1945, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. For readers inside the camps, the scale of these reports was almost impossible to grasp. The articles used unfamiliar language to explain the power of the new weapon, comparing it to thousands of tons of conventional explosives. Maps showed the locations of the two cities. Commentaries speculated about what these events might mean for the future of the war. At the same time, other headlines began to describe diplomatic developments unfolding far from the Pacific Islands. Reports discussed the entry of the Soviet Union into the war against Japan, as well as growing international pressure for the Japanese government to accept surrender terms. Within the barracks, prisoners gathered around the newspapers as they tried to understand what these developments meant. Some read silently, scanning the columns line by line. Others studied the maps, tracing the distance between the reported bombings and the cities they knew back home. For many readers, the newspapers were presenting a version of the war that was far more dramatic and final than anything they had imagined earlier in the conflict. Yet one question remained unanswered. What decision would Japan's leaders make now that the war had reached this point? The answer would arrive only days later, carried once again by the printed headlines that continued to appear on the camp tables. The date was August 15, 1945. Inside the small barracks of American compounds across the Pacific, Japanese women prisoners opened the newspapers that had become their primary window into the outside world. On the front page, the headlines were unambiguous. Emperor Hirohito had announced Japan's surrender. The war, which had defined their lives for nearly 4 years, was finally over. For many, the words were difficult to comprehend. Years of strict propaganda, of carefully managed news, and the constant message of perseverance had shaped their understanding of the conflict. Now, in a single moment, the information on these printed pages contradicted everything they had been taught. The invincibility of the empire, the promise of ultimate victory, everything was gone. Some women sat frozen, staring at the columns of text. Others read aloud to friends and relatives in the barracks, trying to make sense of the new reality. There were tears, but also quiet whispers of disbelief. The empire they had once believed to be unbreakable had fallen. The newspapers did more than announce surrender. They detailed the devastation wrought on Japanese cities, the scale of Allied operations across the Pacific, and the terms imposed on Japan. They described the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, giving figures for casualties, destruction, and the scope of the new weapon. The prisoners could see, for the first time, how extensive the Allied military campaign had truly been. Psychologically, the effect was profound. The women began to reconcile two contrasting worlds, the one they had known, tightly controlled and framed by national propaganda, and the one they now observed through uncensored reporting. For some, the news brought relief. The war's end meant survival, the promise of returning home, and an escape from the uncertainty of internment. For others, it carried shame and guilt, an internalized sense of failure for belonging to the losing side. The presence of American guards distributing newspapers throughout this period was no longer a neutral act. It became part of the historical turning point, the realization that their enemies were not monsters, but human beings following military and administrative procedure, capable of treating captives with dignity. The guards' willingness to provide access to information, an act entirely unnecessary for security, amplified the prisoners' sense of cultural and psychological shock. Outside the barracks, the camp atmosphere also shifted. Work assignments, meal distributions, and daily routines remained largely unchanged, but the conversations inside were different. Women discussed the collapse of the Japanese military in ways they could not have previously imagined. Maps were traced, battles recounted, and the scale of losses compared to prior expectations. It was a subtle, human recalibration of understanding, guided entirely by printed words on paper. The broader context of the surrender began to crystallize for the prisoners as well. Reports included information on the Allied occupation of Japan, the dismantling of military command structures, and the planned repatriation of civilians. The realization dawned that the war had shifted decisively, and there would be consequences for families, communities, and the nation as a whole. In these quiet moments, the newspapers also revealed the human cost of the conflict. Photographs showed devastated cities, civilian casualties, and ruined infrastructure. For women who had lived through shortages, fear, and uncertainty, the images were both shocking and illuminating. They conveyed, in ways that words alone could not, the scale of destruction and the inevitability of Japan's surrender. By the end of August, the women prisoners had internalized a new reality. The war was over, Japan had lost, and the American forces that had once seemed alien or threatening had acted in accordance with rules, discipline, and humane procedures. The simple act of reading newspapers had not just informed them. It had transformed their understanding of the war, their own place within it, and the world beyond the wire fences. And in that transformation, the stage was set for the next chapter: the repatriation, reintegration, and reflection on the human and cultural consequences of years of conflict. By September 1945, the Pacific War had officially concluded with the signing of the Japanese instrument of surrender aboard the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945. The conflict that had stretched across thousands of miles, claimed millions of lives, and reshaped nations was now over. For the prisoners in American camps across the Pacific, this formal declaration marked the beginning of a slow and carefully managed transition from captivity to freedom. Inside the compounds, American military authorities began implementing procedures for camp closures. Registers were updated, health inspections conducted, and logistics for repatriation carefully coordinated. The process was methodical. Prisoners were to be returned to Japan or relocated depending on their individual status and the condition of their home territories. In many cases, the women had spent months, if not years, in the camps. Their daily routines, initially structured by strict guard supervision, now shifted toward preparation for release. The arrival of letters and messages from family members, facilitated by Red Cross intermediaries, added both anticipation and anxiety to the final weeks of confinement. Repatriation was not instantaneous. Transportation posed significant challenges across the Pacific Islands devastated by months of combat. Ships and aircraft had to navigate dangerous waters still scattered with mines, and fuel and supply shortages complicated schedules. Nevertheless, American military planners prioritized the safe and orderly return of civilian prisoners. Medical examinations ensured that contagious diseases did not spread during transit, and relief supplies accompanied the prisoners to ease the transition from camp life to home territories. During this period, daily interactions inside the compounds subtly shifted. Guards, once distant figures enforcing rules, became coordinators of release procedures. Tasks that once carried the weight of supervision, such as distributing clothing, arranging bedding, or escorting prisoners to work details, now acquired a ceremonial quality, signaling the end of confinement. Prisoners, in turn, approached these moments with a mixture of relief and hesitation. Decades later, memoirs would note that this combination of anticipation and lingering distrust shaped the final impressions of life behind barbed wire. The psychological adjustment within the camps mirrored the larger transformation of the Pacific Theater. For years, the prisoners had lived in a controlled environment, isolated from the full scope of wartime reality. The surrender, combined with the gradual return of information through newspapers and conversations with guards, allowed them to reconstruct an understanding of the conflict's final months. Awareness of Japan's military defeats, the atomic bombings, and the impending occupation of their homeland brought both clarity and a deep, sobering reflection. Many women, while relieved at survival, experienced profound shock at the scale of destruction and loss, realizing the magnitude of what had occurred in the world beyond the fences. In addition to repatriation planning, American authorities also addressed the practical logistics of camp closure. Buildings and facilities were dismantled or repurposed for military needs, and remaining supplies, food, clothing, medical equipment, were inventoried. Officers documented camp conditions for official records, reporting on prisoner health, sanitation, and the conduct of guards. These records would later contribute to historical research on prisoner treatment and the administration of Allied internment facilities. The final days of camp life were marked by moments both ordinary and extraordinary. Prisoners helped clean barracks, pack belongings, and prepare for transport, while guards provided guidance and assistance. Amid these routines, the quiet but extraordinary act of reading newspapers had already reshaped the prisoners' understanding of the world. The headlines that once conveyed battles and strategy now confirmed the war's end, the victory of Allied forces, and the collapse of an empire. For the women who had held those papers in trembling hands, the moment was both a culmination and a bridge to the uncertain but inevitable journey home. The transition from captivity to repatriation was not merely physical, it was psychological. The prisoners had been introduced to a reality far broader than the narratives they had received in Japan. They had observed, through reading and discussion, the complexity of military operations, the consequences of strategy, and the human cost of conflict. They had encountered Americans who, despite being their former enemies, provided access to information and basic humanitarian treatment. This combination of knowledge and experience would leave lasting impressions, shaping their understanding of the war for the rest of their lives. Once repatriation began, the Japanese women faced the formidable task of returning to a homeland that had been profoundly transformed. Cities lay in ruins, industrial infrastructure was crippled, and social systems were struggling to absorb millions of returning civilians. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been devastated by the atomic bombings. Tokyo and other urban centers had suffered extensive firebombing. Transportation networks were disrupted, communication systems damaged, and basic necessities, such as food and clean water, were scarce. The reality described in the newspapers they had read in the camps now confronted them in tangible form. For many women, the psychological impact of returning home was compounded by a sense of dislocation. They had spent months or years in captivity under the supervision of an enemy that treated them according to rules and regulations, with access to newspapers that revealed truths often denied at home. Now, they were re-entering a society in which information had been tightly controlled and where the war's outcome carried profound consequences for social, economic, and political life. Reconnecting with family members was both a relief and a shock. Some relatives had survived, others had perished, and many households had been displaced entirely. The experience inside the camps had also altered their perception of Americans and Allied forces. Access to newspapers, combined with fair treatment, created a nuanced understanding of the enemy. Instead of viewing Americans solely as violent combatants or oppressors, prisoners recognized them as human beings operating within a disciplined system, capable of administering justice and observing humanitarian standards. Many women would later reflect that this exposure to uncensored information had helped them process the collapse of the Japanese war effort and prepare for the difficult realities of post-war reconstruction. These experiences were documented in post-war memoirs and historical accounts. Survivors recounted moments of shock and disbelief as they first read reports of battles and bombings, the surrender, and the occupation policies. For some, the newspapers represented a turning point, a moment when the abstract reality of defeat became undeniable. Historians analyzing these accounts note that such encounters with information played a crucial role in shaping post-war attitudes toward both the conflict and the Allied occupiers. Reintegration into Japanese society required adaptation on multiple levels. Women who had been interned often returned with knowledge and perspectives that differed significantly from those who had remained in Japan. Their exposure to uncensored news, Allied administration, and differing cultural norms provided them with a broader understanding of global events. At the same time, returning civilians faced the practical challenges of rebuilding homes, finding employment, and restoring communities devastated by war. Reconstruction programs, occupation directives, and social assistance were slowly implemented, but the initial months and years were often marked by scarcity and uncertainty. The long-term consequences of this period extended beyond practical realities. Psychologically, the experience of imprisonment, coupled with the exposure to truthful reporting of the war, left enduring impressions. Many women carried a deeper understanding of the human and strategic dimensions of the conflict, as well as a recognition of the fragility of wartime narratives. They had witnessed firsthand how access to information, even in small doses, could shift perception, reduce fear, and foster understanding across cultural divides. As decades passed, these personal experiences became valuable historical testimony. Scholars studying the treatment of civilian prisoners and the psychological effects of information control often reference accounts of Japanese women in American camps. Their narratives highlight the interplay between propaganda, access to news, and human response under extreme circumstances. Through their experiences, historians can trace the profound influence that seemingly small acts, like allowing prisoners to read newspapers, had on understanding, morale, and adaptation during the final stages of the Pacific War. Ultimately, the aftermath of the camps extended far beyond the simple act of confinement. The combination of humane treatment, access to uncensored news, and exposure to a different cultural system created a unique bridge between opposing sides of the conflict. When these women returned to Japan, they carried not only the memory of survival, but also insights into the war that few others had experienced firsthand. These insights would inform their lives, their families, and indirectly the historical record of World War II in the Pacific. The story of Japanese women prisoners reading newspapers in American camps is more than a historical footnote. It is a testament to the profound power of information and the human capacity to process truth under extraordinary circumstances. For years, these women had lived in a world where knowledge was carefully curated, where victory was assumed, and where failure was hidden. Inside the camp, a simple bundle of papers disrupted that certainty. It challenged assumptions, provoked reflection, and illuminated the broader reality of a war that had reshaped the globe. In those quiet moments, the prisoners confronted the collapse of an empire, the devastation of cities, and the human cost of conflict. The newspapers became more than news. They were instruments of psychological transformation, allowing prisoners to reconcile personal experience with the unfolding historical reality. The act of reading, so ordinary in peacetime, became extraordinary. It revealed truths that propaganda had concealed and offered a framework for understanding a world that had been defined by chaos, fear, and controlled narratives. Beyond the individual experience, this episode illustrates a larger truth about warfare and humanity. Even amidst destruction and captivity, acts of transparency, dignity, and information sharing can bridge cultural divides. The American Guard's decision to allow prisoners access to newspapers was a small gesture, yet it reshaped perceptions, fostered understanding, and left a lasting imprint on those who experienced it. As history reflects on these moments, it becomes clear that the outcomes of war are not determined solely by battles and strategy. They are shaped also by the choices made in human interactions, the ways in which information is shared, and the respect accorded to others, even to former enemies. The Japanese women who read those newspapers carried home more than survival. They carried insight into the complexities of the world, the consequences of conflict, and the enduring importance of truth. In the quiet of the barracks, as pages turned and eyes traced lines of ink across the paper, history itself revealed its weight, not in the roar of guns, but in the soft, profound impact of knowing.